Welcome to True Crime Garage. Wherever you are, whatever you're doing, thanks for listening. I'm your host, Nick, and with me, as always, is a man you gave a cookie, so he got you a cookie. Here is the captain.
You gave me cookie, I got you cookie. You gave me cookie, I got you cookie. It's good to be seen and good to see you. Thanks for listening. Thanks for telling a friend.
Today, we are still sipping on green slush made by Wiley Roots Brewing Company. Tall cans in the air. Green slush has an ABV of 4.6%, and it's a sour ale with watermelon drink mix. Don't ask what that means, just enjoy. Garage grade 4 out of 5 bottle caps. And who is raising those tall cans in the air with me? Well, it's some of our good friends right here. First up, and Captain, you will like this one. We have a cheers to Jolene from Peyton Manning's favorite city, Omaha, Nebraska.
And a big shout out to Laura from Salem, Oregon.
Next up, we have a double cheers to Scott and Lacey drinking it up in Madison, Indiana.
And a big shout out to Christina in Utica, New York.
Next, we have a big cheers and a Ron Swanson please and thank you that goes out to Diane in San Francisco. And last but certainly not least, we have Brandy from a dry county in Arkansas. Everyone we just mentioned, they helped us out with this week's beer fund, and we thank you.
Yeah, BWRUN beer run. Get you some. Get you some more True Crime Garage by going to our website, truecrimegarage.com, and signing up for our bonus show called Off the Record, If You're Nasty. And that is enough of the business.
All right, everybody, gather around, grab a chair, grab a beer. Let's talk some true crime.
Today's date is July 14th, 1999, Wednesday. It's 13:09 hours. My name is Detective Bud Sampson. We're in the Ravenna Police Department interview room. Along with me is Detective William Mucklow and Detective John Leach of the Alliance Police Department. Also in the room is Joseph Isaac.
Murder in Alliance.
Can you tell us your father's name?
Murder in Alliance.
I'll pay you to do something for me. The thing is, I didn't care about life no more. David knew about it and he took advantage of me. And were you having some hard times with that? Yes. I lost my family. I lost all my friends. I lost my little brother and sister. I lost everything. I had nothing anymore.
Where was her body found?
The living room. So when you walk up the stairs from the entry room, she's right there at the top of the stairs.
So if everything is as it should be, we have a baby up the next floor up in her room. We have two of the children locked in their rooms for the night. And then we have Vinny, who may have been in a crib or in a sleeping situation or may have been roaming the house when whoever came, and we don't have any sign of forced entry. So either this person had access to the home or the door was unlocked or Yvonne knew the individual and invited them in. The way that things were found inside the residence almost would give the appearance that someone was there with her and things were going smoothly up into the point of her murder.
Yeah.
There's is it the dining room table, or one of the tables almost has the appearance that two people may have been sitting there discussing something or
sharing cigarettes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then we have this is a very interesting angle of this case too, is that the killer either knew or felt comfortable enough that either A, none of the children would be able to identify them, or B, none of the children saw what they did and left all the children unharmed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And actually, not only were they unharmed, but the other thinking is that Vinny always slept in his diaper, and Vinny was fully dressed when he was found. He was not covered in blood, assuming if he was crawling around and found his mom, he'd be covered in blood. He was fully dressed, which he cannot do himself. Again, he has a severe disability. He could not dress himself. So the thinking has always been that somebody took care of and dressed Vinny. So not only did they not harm the children, but took care of one of the children.
Which is, yes, a possibility, one, but two could just be happenstance that for whatever reason he was
Dressed.
still dressed from the night
He
before.
could have been and just never made it to her body to get, blood. I mean, but that's the thing too. Like there was, I stress a lot in this season the crime scene and how brutal it is, and that is 100% not for any kind of shock value. It is because the crime scene is so important to who did this. I mean, when you look at it, it is so gruesome and bloody, and there is overkill. I mean, the TV was thrown on top of her. A dresser and a TV were thrown on top of her after this person decapitated her. Anyone who's looked at it has said, well, this wasn't a hit. This looks personal. This is so overkill and violent. Yeah. So that's why, I talk a lot about the crime scene, because it looks so personal. So and then when you think about that, if you think, okay, this is someone who knew her, they were angry at her, maybe it was a father of one of the kids, maybe this person did know Vinny really well. So a lot of her immediate family were looked into, and surprise, a lot of them had reason to kill her. Her dad was allegedly sexually abusing her and her sisters for years, and she thought that he was doing it to her kids too. Her mother-in-law hated her because she was taking the welfare checks from Vinny, and the mother-in-law was taking care of her. So when you look at this crime scene, it does not look like someone was hired to kill her. It looks like somebody who knew her did this and took care of Vinny on their way out.
Well, they even suspected David's girlfriend for a while, right? Because you have this situation where you're dating this guy, and now he's having a baby with his ex. It's kind of an odd situation.
Yes, and we get into Amy in the coming episodes. But, Amy's interesting because her and Yvonne hated each other, obviously. They're both, in love with the same guy, and there's kids involved. But, the thing has always been is Amy would actually be the last person that was able to get into Yvonne's house, because if Yvonne even saw Amy at her doorstep, everyone who knew Yvonne was like, oh no, she would have beat the shit out of Amy immediately. She wasn't getting in the house. So it's just really interesting. Amy, of course, had a motive, but would she even be able to get in the house? And then we go back to this whole, we find out she's a sex worker. That could be why there's a lock on the door to lock the kids in so they don't walk out on something.
Right.
So did she have one of her Johns over that night? There's just so many people, and yes, Joe sounds convincing, and yes, this could be what happened. But then when I look at the crime scene, I just again go, no way this was Joe. This was someone she was sleeping with, or somebody that she already has a baby with. It wasn't Joe hired as a hit. It's very confusing.
Well, there have been people that have said that the way that they found the crime scene, as you said, the TV thrown on top of her, there was a bookshelf overturned as well?
There was a TV on top of a dresser. So the dresser and the TV were on top of her.
Okay, so somebody attempted to probably, in one foul swoop, I imagine, try to throw both of those items, tip them over on top of her at the same time. And some have speculated, look, that might be somebody who's trying to make the crime scene have the appearance of a struggle. To me, I look at that and say, no, this is somebody that wanted to destroy this woman, that slitting her throat was not good enough. Watching her expire in just a matter of seconds on the floor there was not good enough. They had to take it a step further and throw these heavy items onto her body as it lie there lifeless already. And, we have a certain understanding of, and rightfully so, descriptive way of hate crime. But one thing that gets lost sometimes in these murder cases is the individual that kills the victim, 9 times out of 10, hates the victim, hates the victim to the point of destruction. For whatever reason, something happened, they feel wronged, they feel challenged, or any number of scenarios can play out. But in that moment, in the heat of the moment, that individual hates the victim so much so that they want to kill them, they want to destroy them. And that's what I see when we're talking about this crime scene here, that it was somebody was in such rage that they took this extra step. It was unnecessary to kill her, because she's already dead. It was unnecessary to do any of these further actions before leaving the home. Let's stay on eyewitnesses, because wasn't there another possible eyewitness? We talked about the children, we talked about the other eyewitness, but there was another eyewitness that saw a man, and the description sounds somewhat similar to the other one. I'm just a little confused on what time and where this falls into the timeline of the 31st and the 1st.
Yeah, so this guy, very similar. He was another neighborhood guy who, again, just went to the police and said, hey, look, I think I saw this, might be helpful. It was actually the night of the murder. He said around twilight, he was walking his dog. So who the hell knows what twilight means? He saw a man trying to get into the house. And that's really all we know. We know that the police also took him to a kind of relaxation therapy that they also took George to try and get him to remember what they saw. George said it seemed more like an interrogation. He kind of seemed like he was hooked up to a lie detector test. So they did the same thing with this witness and nothing came of it. Again, this was not given to the defense in discovery. So this was another Brady violation. What we do know about that night is she did have quite a few visitors. I mean, her house was not this home that no one went to, this quiet mom with, kids. It was really a high trafficked home. Her dad was there that day. We don't know where he was that evening. We do know he puts himself there that day. We know that around 5:30, her neighbor was there. He was someone who was seen with her. He said he went on a bike ride afterwards. You can't really account for that. So that's already two people we know were at her house that day that, we don't know where they went afterwards at the time of the murder. According to Joe, he was there that evening. So was this guy one of them? Was it a different guy that the neighbor saw trying to get into the home around twilight? It just raises so many questions.
Yeah, but the eyewitnesses that are not connected to the family, they're just neighbors or passerbyers, they're all putting these individuals well below 6 foot.
Yeah. So both George Hale and this other man, two separate witnesses, two neighbors, don't know anybody involved in this case, say that the guy trying to get into the home or the guy leaving the home was about 5'8", dark hair. Yeah, I mean, that wouldn't be Joe either way, assuming that, that what they saw actually happened. So George Hale was on the stand for the post-conviction hearing when they went back to court for the Brady violation for George Hale. And on his cross is when he kind of came across as a weak witness. I personally don't think George Hale is, but cross-examination can always shake people. And basically on the cross, the prosecution got him to say he just didn't know if the man was leaving her house or if he was just, he couldn't for sure say if he was leaving the house or not. I believe George. I've seen his interviews with, reputable investigative reporters who have looked into this case. His story has always been the same. And I do think he saw somebody leaving the house that morning, whether it was the murderer, whether it was someone who had some kind of appointment with her that morning and stumbled in and found her dead body and was like, oh, crap. But I do believe George saw somebody leaving that house after she was dead.
And twilight typically is, I think everybody has a little bit of a different definition for what twilight is. It's one of those things that you hate to hear a witness say because it could mean different things to different people. But I always think of it as like the time of when I can no longer see the sun in the sky, but it's still light out. So around sunset or slightly just after, which is interesting because that plays to the 7 p.m.
I always thought it was a teenage vampire movie.
The time frame at the earlier part of that time frame, but
Team Edward.
How else are they coming up with that 7 p.m.? Is it because there is somebody that says they spoke to Yvonne at 5 or 6 o'clock that night?
So that was the neighbor that was seen with her at 5:30. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and then
but wasn't he a bit of a creep himself?
Yes.
Okay.
He's definitely an odd guy. We talked to him in the podcast, but we do not think he was involved. Again, this looks like overkill. I mean, he's a tiny little guy. He's weird. We just didn't get that from him. What is his motive? what would he be so pissed off about? Yes, maybe he was a peeper, but other than that, I mean, the guy has no record. He just seems like he still lives in the same house. I mean, if you murdered this girl, you would think he'd probably leave. I mean, there was just many reasons to make us think like, you know, he probably wasn't involved.
And I'm with you. I don't think he lines up, and I find it interesting that he speaks with you guys all these years later. It doesn't seem like he's dodging anything here, hasn't moved away. But I will throw this out there. When we go into motive and things of that nature, is I have seen in more than one case where we have an individual that is very much like this that did commit the crime. And where I'm going with this, Maggie, is that this guy would see men in and out of Yvonne's home all hours of the day. And then he's over there, gets inside. She's invited him in. She rejects him. And then his mind goes to, she doesn't say no to anybody else. Why is she saying no to me? What is wrong with me? And then he turns on her. So I've seen that in some cases. I'm not saying that's the situation here. We know that Yvonne could be described as promiscuous. I'm not saying that there were men coming in and out of her house at all hours of the day, although it seems like that may have been the situation.
Yeah, exactly. And, you know, we think about that too with Joe. Maybe that Joe did do this and he also got pissed that she rejected him and he just kind of lost it. The interesting thing, and I'm curious to hear what you guys think, is, you know, I guess we could put Jim aside, the neighbor, but I want to talk about Joe because I don't know as much about Jim. I just know he doesn't have a record. I mean, everything we know about Joe is he is this kind person. Yes, he's troubled, but it never seemed to manifest in a violent, deviant way. Joe's friend said he didn't even really do drugs. I mean, he smoked weed and drank. So, you know, he's this kind, nice kid. Would he suddenly just snap and become this rageful killer when he had nothing like that in his past? I'm just curious to hear your thoughts.
Well, he has a lot of trauma in his past. So, to me, that would give him the capability. The thing I can't get over with Joe is a couple things. One, the confession before he talks to police. Because he's basically telling people, I did this before he even talked with police.
Yeah. Allegedly. Yeah. Did I put that in the podcast? I couldn't remember.
Well, and maybe that's something that we need to address here if you're able to, is what would be the motivation of this Miss Moore and Mr. Campbell for their statements that we spoke with Joe Wilkes on the day of the murder. And he says, I'm here to, you know, I've been hired to kill someone for whoever, but what would be their motivation for their statement? Because the captain's absolutely right. That's how they find Joe Wilkes. And that's something that if he did tell them that, it's very difficult for anybody to go, he told somebody that, and then that night someone he knew was murdered.
Yep.
I'm sorry, but it gets very difficult to get past that one.
It is.
Not so much for David Thorne, because again, there are a million different scenarios that we could have Joe Wilkes as the actual murderer here, and David Thorne didn't have anything to do with it, and he just had the worst luck in the world that he interacted with this guy and was friends with this guy before and after.
Absolutely. I mean, we think about this all the time. So Rose and Chris are interesting. So I mentioned, you know, we rack our brains every day trying to think about what would their motive be. We don't know. One of our hypotheses is, you know, Chris did get a lot of trouble with the law. He was actually arrested like a day or two after he told police about this. You know, we've speculated he could have been an informant. They just needed to lean on him for this. And Rose was his girlfriend and he just told her to shut up and just stick to the story and whatever. You know, it could have been any sort of combination of that. I don't know what their motive would have been. I don't know if they lied. What I do know is that their stories are odd. They change a lot between, no, it was definitely not a pocket knife, and then by trial it was a pocket knife. I find that something really difficult to get around. How do you mistake an 8-inch blade and then suddenly it's a pocket knife? You know, she specifically mentioned a sheath. I think that's weird. His clothing changed colors. They say he was in a white Nike tracksuit at the mall. The pants that he found were black. That doesn't bother me as much. You know, people can mistake colors. All of our memories are not perfect. But, you know, there are just weird things about them. In Joe's confession, he never mentioned seeing them. He says, I was at the mall and blah, blah, blah. They specifically asked, did you tell anybody about this? So it's weird. It's just weird. It's one of those mysteries that I don't know if we'll ever have answers to what happened at the mall, and if they lied or why they lied if they did.
Well, when they come forward, it's 3 months later. So it's easy to go, okay, maybe they didn't remember what color pants the guy was wearing. It is weird that Joe isn't a little more upfront about having talked to somebody that night when he seems to be giving the police everything else that they're asking for during the course of that confession. The one thing, though, that I find interesting is, do you see, is there a road that investigators could take that somehow leads them to Joe Wilkes through David Thorne? And then now 3 months later, we can't say, oh, we found Joe Wilkes by this avenue. We need to create an avenue that led us to Joe Wilkes, because what the jury is going to see in this case, if David would have had a good defense team, it should have been pointed out that, look, for 3 months, these guys had nothing. And they tried to build a case against David Thorne and they couldn't. So you as jurors have to ask yourself why. If David is so damn guilty here, why did they have nothing for 3 months? And so now we have this. I mean, and here's where I'm going with this, Maggie. I wonder, phone records. Joe Wilkes, does he use his name when he checks into the hotel that night? You know, there are ways that could lead you to Joe Wilkes as an investigator that later you can go back and say, you know what, Chris Campbell, you're not such a good guy. Why don't you help us out? And we'll help you out a little bit at the same time, because we need somebody to tell us about this Joseph Wilkes guy.
Exactly.
Oh, and that girlfriend of yours that can you think you can get her to go along with your statement?
Well, that's the thing too. They knew that they were at the mall that night, and it's just so interesting because Joe has never denied seeing them, but he has said it was just a casual conversation. You know, it wasn't something that stuck out to him when he's being interrogated by the police and telling them every accounting of his day. So it's just, I'm with you on that. Maybe that's exactly what it was. That's why, you know, we have really been looking into, was Chris an informant of some kind? Did he have relations with the police? Could they have leaned on him? It's all possible. There's so many possibilities in this case.
Yeah, the other thing that bothers me is the child when he says that he saw Jeremy or what was the other name?
Jimmy.
Or Jimmy. It sounded like he gave 2 or 3
Yeah, there was
names,
another name. Yeah, they were all J names.
Right, which goes along with...
But it wasn't Joe.
Yeah, but it goes along with Joseph, where maybe he just can't remember. I know it started with a J, so it's Jeremy or whatever it is. So I think that has always bothered me.
And that's very interesting, Captain, because we know by Joe's own statements that he had been to Yvonne's at least once, maybe twice. Is that right, Maggie? No more than maybe 2 times?
According to him,
3 times if we include the murder?
Yeah, it's one of those kind of murky areas.
So Captain might be hitting on something here.
Your mom.
This child may be trying his best to help, but because he's only met this guy once or twice, or maybe he's having trouble placing the name, and he's getting close with the J names, and that's a very interesting thing.
I absolutely agree with you guys. I don't think we can really, just brush aside what Vinny said. And I think, every one of these things on its face is not, major, but when you put them all together, it's really confusing, I'd say.
Well, I have a question.
Confusing.
I have a question for you. Joe has recanted his confession before. Is that when he's recanting the confession, is he saying, I wasn't there, I didn't murder anybody?
No. He's always put himself there. He says he didn't do it. He says he walked in and she was already dead and he panicked and left.
So if he wasn't there with the purpose of being paid to commit a homicide, why in those statements is he there at all?
One statement, he went to invite her to a hotel party. In one statement...
That's why he's at the hotel?
Yes. In another statement, he's there to have sex with her.
Again, she could have rejected him,
Right.
and he flies into a rage, does something that he almost immediately regrets, and now... Lucky him. See, that's one thing, the other issue that I have with getting away from the possibility of Joe Wilkes as the actual murderer. Because, you said, well, he didn't have much of a record or didn't have a record and he didn't do drugs. Yet by his own admission in that confession, regardless of how they got to that statement, it is still his sworn statement at the time. He says, I did some drugs that night before going over there to kill her. And then later, his own words again, to save my own ass, I said, I had to tell them that David Thorne hired me. And so it's like,
Right.
Is this guy smart enough? And you said he's no dummy. Is he smart enough to be creating ways to save his own butt?
Well, I think so.
I was so high on these drugs when I killed her. I didn't know what I was doing. I was out of my mind, man. Oh, and if that doesn't work and I need somebody else to save my butt, I can blame some of this on David Thorne. And maybe I called him the next day for no reason other than because we were friends. And I know that maybe they might be able to
Or
find.
maybe he called David to confess.
Called him to confess. There's any number of things. And we see if, in fact, all the things that everybody says about David Thorne and Joe Wilkes' relationship is true other than this murder part, given Joe's background and how he was raised and the horrible environments that he was raised in, and then David being a little older, it looks like David kind of takes him under his wing. He, we know David's a car guy. He gives him some kind of junk car that somebody like David could fix up, and that he would actually have a vehicle so he could get to and from a job. And David says, look, I didn't do favors for this kid because I hired him to kill my ex-girlfriend. I did favors for the kid because, one, I wanted to help him out, but two, I would help him out and it would create inconveniences for me. Now this guy's always reaching out to me. Can you drive me here? Can you drive me to I'm going to lose my job if somebody doesn't take me there. And, I can get this kid a vehicle for a few $100 and it helps him out, but ultimately helps me out as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, there's so many possibilities, and we haven't even gone into, the fact that the cops didn't at the beginning think David actually had anything to do with this. By their own admission, they went to the psychic. I mean, and that is the biggest bombshell of this whole case is what the police say to the psychic.
Well, let's circle back to that, Maggie, before we get too far away from something else that I'm very intrigued on. I always love when we cover cases. I want to hear the suspects. I want a roll call of the suspects. And let's start with the J suspects, because we were talking about Vinny trying to help out, saying, I saw a Jimmy or a Jeremy or somebody with that sounding name hurt my mom, push my mom. Interestingly enough, there is a Jeremy in this case and there's a Jimmy in this case. Who is the Jeremy and how is he tied to our victim?
Yeah, so Jeremy is a family friend. It's Eric, who's Yvonne's boyfriend, baby daddy. It's his mother's boyfriend.
Okay.
So Jeremy, knew Vinny very well, actually, because Vinny was living with him and Linda. Vinny was not in Yvonne's custody. She pretty much gave Vinny up at birth because he was disabled. She couldn't really take care of him. And she gave him to her boyfriend's parents to take care of. So Vinny was raised by Jeremy and Linda for the most part. So he would know Jeremy if he saw Jeremy. And one of the names was
And
Jeremy.
if there was a motive for Jeremy to be involved or have done this, it would be simply all tied to the boy Vinny. They're practically raising Vinny the majority of the time. Not practically, they are raising him the majority of the time. They're his main caregivers, as it sounds to me. Yet Yvonne is getting the disability checks from the state, and she's using them to fund her lifestyle or raise her other children.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
Well, again, I think the whole idea of, if she is a sex worker and having guys coming in and out of her house, that creates a motive for almost any male that's in her life.
Mm-hmm.
Like you said, they come on to her, or they think, well, she's saying yes to all these guys, she'll say yes to me. And if she doesn't, there's a lot of guys that would go into a rage.
And then there's also a Jim or a Jimmy in this.
Right. And that's the neighbor that we talked about. Jim is the neighbor who also knew the kids. I don't know how well they knew him. I mean, according to Jim, him and Yvonne would just hang out outside in the yard sometimes, and the kids would run around his yard because their yard's connected. There was no fence between them. So it seems like he knew the kids, but certainly not on the level that Jeremy did.
And if he were, in fact, the guilty party, it would fall into what the captain was just talking about there, where this would be, he had some kind of infatuation or obsession with this. I mean, she was a very beautiful young woman. And again, if you have a scenario where he thought they were friendly and all of a sudden she rejects him or calls him a name or finds him inadequate or anything, you have those possibilities. One person that I want to hit on before we get into the amazing, wonderful Alliance Police Department and how fine and fantastic of a job they just continue to do. I want to talk about somebody that, if in fact the things that I've heard about this individual on your podcast make him probably the most disgusting and despicable individual that's referenced so far. I understand you have some episodes to get to, but Sherman. Mm-hmm. Let's talk about Sherman, because I have Sherman. If I'm looking at this case from a clean slate, that's the guy that I want to talk to the most, and the people around him are the ones that I want to ask about Sherman the most.
Off the bat, I've called him. The number that I have for him isn't working. I've reached out to the kids to ask them, for a number. I have tried to reach him and I can't. So Sherman, again, they're Jehovah's. They live a very quiet life, but we have heard from her friends a lot of horror stories about the abuse that he put her. And, very recently we heard from another close friend and her sisters, we believe, were also maybe abused by him sexually. And we do know that Yvonne thought that it was possible he was doing this to her kids. And she actually set up a video camera in her house with tapes. Eric's actual dad, not Jeremy, Eric's dad, Fred, helped her set up videotapes to try and catch Sherman in the act. This was one of Fred's statements before he passed away. So we have not been able to...
Like a nanny cam type situation.
But of course it was, 1999. So it's like a giant camera that you could see in some of the crime scene photos on top of her fridge. And those tapes were collected, and Fred had asked for the tapes back and he never got them. So we don't know what's on those tapes. They don't seem to exist anymore. But Sherman, to me too, what if Yvonne was pregnant with his kid? What if one of these kids is Sherman's kid? That has certainly crossed our minds.
That could be the reason why the one kid has certain disabilities.
And I mean, anything is possible. The more we've talked to people who knew her, the more it seems like the abuse was pretty severe. It seems like, even their mother probably knew in a lot of these cases. They know, and there's nothing they can do, or, they're also abused. Again, these are all allegations. I'm not saying Sherman did this. This is just what we have heard from multiple people. We've thought about him as a suspect. And the thing that we just keep coming back to is I don't think that he would have wanted this attention. They really seem to recoil from it, and not necessarily in a way of like, we did this. It seems like they really just do not want this attention at all. They have never spoken to media. They've never been a part of it. They, kind of wrapped it up, and it was quiet. And again, that could be because he knows some dirty things are going to lead back to him, or again, because they're quiet people and he just wouldn't murder his daughter because he doesn't want all this attention, is something we've really thought about.
I don't care who you are. Nobody wants to be known as an incest driven sexual predator. And so one thing that we see here in this case is the potential of a possible cover up. And the reason why I bring him up, and there's another cover up possibility that we're going to quickly get into and move along to here, but with Sherman, in relation to him, if there were to be another type of cover up, if she was killed, that's one of the leading motivations for murder in anywhere, is to cover up previous crimes. And if in fact Sherman is guilty of the rumors that you have heard, then it seems to me like that would be something that he may want to cover up. Maybe he went there that night to try to reason with her or threaten her to keep her quiet, or to collect those tapes. Maybe she threatened him. That's one thing that I think we haven't really touched on much, is Yvonne's personality. She didn't seem to me to be much of a take a lot of shit kind of person.
No, she she was not.
She was feisty would be a very polite and kind way of describing her.
Yeah. So we have found out, through our reporting, that Yvonne was a scammer in a sense. She would shake people down. So the idea that, she was threatening her dad to expose him is very plausible. Maybe she did catch something on that camera and he went over. Again, he puts himself there that day. I have no idea where he was that night. Of course, we don't have any recorded interviews with him from the police. So that's really helpful when trying to go back to this investigation. There's not a single interview with him. So we don't really know where he was that night, what he was doing at all.
And one thing that doesn't sit well with me about Sherman, and it's coming from law enforcement's own mouth, when they went to talk with her mother, they say even now she's a shell of an individual. And so if you happen to hear, your husband say, well, that's it, she's dead to me, and then you end up finding her dead the next day, there's going to be doubt in your mind. So, it's one thing to find your dead child, but then if on top of that your husband's responsible for it, that puts you in a very scary situation.
Yeah, I think Tanya was in a scary situation before the murder too. I think that was just a dark household. The abuse that she endured, if it is true, would certainly explain why, she was allegedly so promiscuous and having children at 16. A lot of it, makes sense. She was sexually traumatized, and that's often what happens. But yeah, so there's, and I know this is what you want to talk about, there's no interview with Sherman because the police did a really not good job with this investigation. So yeah, we could talk about that.
Well, yeah, and real quick before we move on, in regards to the tapes, if they existed or what was on them, we don't know. As you said, we can't find them today. And one thing with those tapes and Yvonne's personality and attitude and being a possible victim to Sherman, or maybe her kids are victimized by this guy, there doesn't necessarily have to be anything incriminating on those tapes for him to want those tapes to go away bad enough to potentially do something like this. It could just simply be the threat of those tapes, of her saying, I got a video camera running in here all the time. I've been taping you while you're over here. That doesn't necessarily have to mean that she caught anything on camera, just that it was happening and he perceived the threat of being outed because of that camera. Now, just so we don't dance around the subject anymore, why don't we talk about the Alliance PD, as it were, 1999? And I understand that they've made a lot of effort to clean things up there since then, but it was not the most well-run, oiled machine back then as we would want it to be as citizens and taxpayers. And a lot of that comes out in those tapes when we have detectives talking with the psychic. And thank you, Maggie, for including that in the series, because that psychic woman, just amazing. She's looking at these detectives and going, why haven't you guys looked into this? Why is Yvonne hanging out with so many cops? Why is she friends with so many cops? Why are there so many married officers, married with children officers that seem to be friendly with her, or some have some kind of relationship with her?
Yeah. These cops, Mucklow and Sampson, never thought that these tapes would see or hear the light of day, ever. Ever. This was one of the Brady violations at trial. This was never presented. It was hidden. They got it in the post-conviction. And the tapes, actually, I got. The attorneys never had the tapes that I know of. They have the transcripts. So this is the first time anyone's hearing the tapes. And it's like you said, the psychic, I mean, it's just jaw-dropping at what they are telling the psychic about their own department and people that they had heard officers were sleeping with her, for money. And she asked if they ever looked into any of these people, and they're like, no. Did you look into, the dad? No. Did you look into Jeremy? Well, I guess we should do that. They honed in on David, and it seems like we don't have a formal interview with Jeremy. We don't have a formal interview with Jim. We don't have formal interviews with any of these officers that were allegedly sleeping with her. Half of these we don't even have interviews with. So if they spoke to them, where is that? Why would you not speak to her father that you tell this psychic was abusing her? It's just mind-blowing that the entire case file is David and then Joe. And, so the department at the time, I do a whole episode on this because it's, I could do 5 episodes on it. In 1998, the Chief Black, and 8 officers were fired for severe corruption for stealing guns, drugs, and money from the evidence room. And your guess is as good as mine as where the guns, drugs, and money were going when they were stealing it. So, at the time of her murder, the department is in chaos. There are still folks that are, seriously corrupt who just were not caught and fired. It was incredible what was happening at the time in the department. And then this young mother is murdered, and the investigation was so poor. It will just blow your mind.
I mean, and to simplify, it almost seems like law enforcement went, okay, well, it's either Eric or it's David, and Eric's in jail, so it has to be David. Oh, wait, David was at this wrestling class, and he has
3 counties
away, and he has solid alibis, not just one person, multiple people. And then they just kind of stop the investigation for 3 months.
That's how the case files are. There's nothing from May. There's nothing from June. Whoop! All of a sudden, we have Joe Wilkes in July. I mean, I just think it's really bizarre. What were you doing in that time?
Well, and for those not familiar with the case, we should point out here that David Thorne is at this martial arts class. This was routine. This was a once a week thing that had gone on for weeks prior to this. This was not him going out of his way to be several counties away conveniently at the time of the murder. These guys, it doesn't seem like they were starting a murder investigation. It seems to me like they were starting from scratch because they just didn't know what to do or how to conduct this type of investigation, not with any kind of efficiency or thoroughness that's going to seal a conviction. You hear the psychic, when the detectives give her information, she's looking at them, and you hear it in the tone of her voice when she's throwing questions back at them. She's like, you guys didn't look at that? You guys didn't look at this? You can tell she wants to look at these 2 guys and go, is this your first day on the job? Did you just get deputized this morning? Because all these things that are obvious to a psychic woman didn't appear to be obvious to these detectives. or they turned their heads away from it and did not want to look in those directions.
I think that's, we talk about this too, is if someone else killed her, the police certainly had motive to cover it up because of whatever was going on with them. They just wanted to brush it under the rug, and none of their sex with her or even maybe drug connections. I mean, the police tell the psychic they found weed at the crime scene, marijuana. There is no marijuana in evidence. Where is that marijuana that you allegedly found at this crime scene? So whatever happened in this murder, I think the police definitely wanted to brush it under the rug very quickly, for their own sake.
Well, that's a good point too, because one of the things I wondered is, we have this girl dead. You know that there's officers that are having some kind of sexual relationship with her. At that point, you either have to turn this investigation over to somebody else, or you have to figure out which officers are having a relationship, make sure they have nothing to do with the case. And then when you say, oh, well, they found weed and it goes missing, well, probably because she got that weed from a police officer, or there's some connection from that weed.
Well, again, and that's, I mean, they were literally stealing guns, drugs, and money from the evidence room. And like I said, it's anyone's guess where that was going. There's missing marijuana from her house. I mean, you put the pieces together. It just is really shady.
It sounds to me like there's a portion of their evidence room back in the 90s that was set items that are set aside for an officers only barbecue that was probably happening on the reg. Oh, we got some weed and cocaine for free. Oh, you like collecting guns? Here you go, buddy. Let's get together, officers and wives only, and let's have a big blowout.
Officer wives,
that's
girlfriends.
What it sounds like to me.
Yeah,
regardless of where it came from or how she got it. But the thing here too, and I hate the term police cover up because I think it's way overused, and that takes away from the severity of the situation when you use a term way too much and use it when it's not necessary. In most cases, they go, oh, well, this cop knew the victim, so clearly the whole department's covering it up. Nay, 9 times out of 10, what I've seen in these investigations, they don't mind busting and popping one of their own. They want to get the guilty party. Here, this situation is unique because if what was going on that's been speculated, if any of that is true, they're not covering for the guy that actually killed her because of to save his butt. They're covering for the whole department's. They were committing, they were committing, breaking the law time and time again themselves. And so they're covering their own asses by covering for one of their own, if in fact what we've heard has been true.
Yeah, no, exactly. And that's the thing. It's so messy. Could that guy that have been seen that morning been a cop, like George Hale said? Sure. And he was just, cleaning up some stuff because he was like, oh, fuck, if there is drugs and stuff in here, we got to get rid of it because it's coming back to us. It's like everything is possible.
I think what I see here, look, there's no smoking gun that tells me that David is 100% innocent. I strongly question the investigation. I even more so question Joseph Wilkes. I do see plenty of scenarios where Joe could be guilty and David just is collateral damage. I also see scenarios where we have other suspects that I have to believe. I've not reviewed the trial transcripts, but one thing to point out here is that Joe had no trial. He confessed and then he testified against David Thorne, and not overly whelmingly convincing in his testimony against David Thorne either. I think you pointed out that on your show that he says, I don't know, it seems to be the most common answer that he gives while on the stand. I don't know. I see a case where we have other possibilities. We have other good suspects, and I can't believe that the defense even made reference to these people. The whole thing here is, I've always said that your homicide or the victim, if you're a family member of a victim, your case is only as good as the desk of the officer that your case file lands on. And that's the unfortunate truth of these scenarios. And obviously there are some better police forces than others. That will always be the truth. But one thing that gets lost in a lot of these true crime cases, especially the ones that are solved, is, we've presented some cases here in the garage where you get these guys that just get bum freaking lawyers that they're happy to take your money, but they ain't going to do any work for it.
Well, that's the thing. They paid a lot of money. This was a private attorney that they hired, David's family. They were not broke. I mean, they had money to hire this private attorney.
Well, and the defendant is usually blinded by the idea, oh, this guy cost a lot of money. He must know what he's doing. Well, I don't know if this guy knew what he was doing or not, but he didn't act that way or conduct himself that way. He called 3 witnesses. Yeah. The guy's could be facing the death penalty.
Yeah.
Well, it reminds me a lot of the Ryan Ferguson trial, because you have one guy confessing to the crime, the other guy saying, I wasn't, 1, I have an alibi, but 2, I wasn't involved at all. And then you have a crappy lawyer that basically says, oh, well, prosecution didn't prove their point, so I'm not going to really defend it much. How many episodes have you released so far, and how many more do you have to go?
So there's 14, and we have 6 more, and it is with some of the very exciting key people that can answer or just muddy more of this. But, it's this is a crazy case, and I'm so thankful for you guys for putting it on your airwaves, especially from Ohio, because somebody knows something. We have a tip line number now that people can call. If anyone in Ohio in the Alliance area knows anything, the number is 888-863-9550. So I really thank you guys for this.
Thank you as always for coming on the show. We're looking forward to the final episodes of Murder in Alliance.
Murder in Alliance.
Can you tell us your father now?
Murder in Alliance.
I'll pay you to do something for me.
Thank you guys so much for the support. Thanks for telling a friend. So much more you can dive into in this case. And that's why this week's recommended listening will be Murder in Alliance, wherever you get your podcast.
And join us back here in the garage next week for a new case. Until then, be good, be kind, and don't live.